and welcome to another episode of Racial Equity in Richmond, a component of the Richmond Racial Equity Essays Project. We're here today with Laura Dobbs and Stephen Wade. And again, my name is Ebony Walden. In this series, is just asking Richmonders their thoughts on how do we achieve racial equity in our city and in our region. So excited to have you two here today and excited to jump into the conversation and your perspectives on this important topic for our nation and our city. So if I could start with just asking you guys to quickly introduce yourselves, your name, obviously, what do you do in the daytime? And that could include, or nighttime, right? So that could include, we have multiple hats that we put on, not just the day, like your affiliations too. And what was the other thing that I wanted to ask? And how long you've been living in this area, sorry.
Great, well, I'll go first. Really glad to be here and to have been asked, Ebony. So excited to be a part of this awesome project, thinking about this great city and how to make it greater, how to make it more just, more racially equitable. My name's Stephen Wade. I'm from Alexandria, Virginia, lived in Richmond for about 4 years now. I feel like my full-time job is a father. I have 2 little kids who I love and drive me crazy. I'm a husband, a resident of the Fifth. I work during the day at the Virginia Department of Social Services, working on substance use disorder, trying to better support families. And then on the side, I am the vice president of the board of the Partnership for Smarter Growth. I have a deep background in affordable housing, policy and advocacy, over 20 years career, as well as working in health equity in Northern Virginia, DC, in Southeast Michigan, and now here in Richmond. So really glad to be here and to chat about what I think are some real opportunities for the city.
Oh, lovely. And then just for those who don't know what Partnership for Smarter Growth does, could you give us a little plug?
Very well. I should have done that myself. Partnership for Smarter Growth, small, primarily volunteer board-led nonprofit here in the city, been here for a number of years, primarily focused on the intersection of housing, transportation, and the environment. So working on kind of trying to protect the environment through all kinds of mechanisms, limit auto-oriented development out on the fringes of our region, while encouraging development, but encouraging development that benefits the community, that's equitable, that's fair, that serves the community. So it's both a kind of try to limit things happening on the fringe that are further separating us, and bring us to bring more healthy, equitable, greener, fair development in the city and inner jurisdictions.
I love that. My background's in urban planning, so I'm like, yes to all.
Planner nerds unite. I know. Sometimes I want to admit about planners, sometimes I don't.
Well, I can totally see that as well. Don't tell anybody your urban planner parties, and they'll tell you all the things that are wrong with the city and how bad traffic is. So I would love to introduce yourself, Laura.
Sure. My name is Laura Dobbs, and I'm an attorney with the Virginia Poverty Law Center. The Poverty Law Center is a statewide support center for all the legal aids across the state. We also advocate on a variety of civil issues affecting low-income Virginians, from healthcare to public benefits, consumer law, and I specifically work on housing, landlord-tenant issues. And I wear a few different hats. I do lobbying, trying to get better laws and protections for tenants, tenant education. I feel like your rights are only good as your ability to know what those rights are and enforce them, as well as connecting different tenant advocates to share best practices and training other housing attorneys across the state. I'm a Richmond transplant, so I'm originally from North Carolina, grew up in Monroe, North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte. And I've been going on my 3rd year here in Richmond, Virginia. When I initially came to the Poverty Law Center, it was for a project focused on addressing the high rates of eviction in Central Virginia, Richmond and Petersburg. Now my focus is much more statewide.
Okay, lovely, great. So it'll be an interesting conversation because I think that you might be the newest, both of you folks, to Richmond that I've seen. So I'd love to engage Richmond through your eyes, because I think both perspectives of, the come here's and then have been here a long time. But you both do interesting work and sort of cut on some of my passion areas around about housing and planning and just making sure people have what they need to thrive from that basic housing stability perspective. But tell me what got you into to your work? Is there a pivotal moment or experience that you can point us to that really got you into the work that you do and that you feel passionate about? And if so, what was that? I'd like to just get an idea of who people are before we get into their opinions about things.
Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I grew up in the South, different state, but there's a lot of similarities. Where I grew up was a community sort of split in two. It was a, other side of the racetrack kind of town, where one side you had the wealthy white families, and on the other side you had, poor Black and Latino families, and a lot of immigrants lived there. My high school was like mashing those two cultures together. And so on a day-to-day basis, seeing how those prejudices play out amongst teachers, other students, how they treat each other based on, the brand of t-shirt you were wearing or the color of your skin. And I think one of the things that really drove home those prejudices is an incident that happened in a math class where the teacher told a Latino student, "Go back where you came from." And all the Latino students in the high school decided to protest to try to get disciplinary action against this teacher. And so they started wearing white t-shirts to school every day, and during lunch went out in front of the school and protested. The school responded by deeming anyone wearing a white t-shirt as a member of a gang, and at the end of the week called everyone to the office and gave them citations. And I didn't have the legal knowledge or context of the written rules of why this is wrong. I just knew instinctively that this is pretty messed up. Fast forward to getting into my legal career, I started off doing voting rights, and I was working with a lot of different disenfranchised communities on voting rights issues. But as getting into those conversations, seeing that it's just one of so many that exist at the same time, such that, depending on your zip code, it affected everything from, the health of the environment, quality of the schools, quality of the housing, the wealth gap, the health gap. And so these were citizens, thinking particularly of this town in Lake Charles, Louisiana. They were trying to deal with redistricting. But at the heart of that, the issues they were trying to address was environmental racism. Schools are still segregated, probably more segregated than they were 50 years ago. And housing inequities. So really, that's what drove home that yes, voting is important, but unless you're addressing those underlying needs, those other things aren't going to fall into place. So then I pivoted to working in the area of housing.
Wow, that was quite the powerful experience, and kind of crazy in high school, but that activism in response to that was also amazing too. That gives us a good idea of who you are and where you're coming from. That was great. Thank you, Laura. What about you, Stephen?
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Laura. That is super interesting. And I guess I've got to go back to high school a little bit too. I'm from Alexandria, so I went to what was called T.C. Williams High School, just changed in the last month to, I think, Alexandria City High School. T.C. Williams, I haven't done the research, but I think a racist superintendent that we had up there. So, but
one of my colleagues went there.
Yeah, there's a lot of connections, and people probably also know T.C. Williams because of Remember the Titans. So if you choose to believe Disney, then you can think about that story. But as someone, and I still have a lot of pride in being a member of that community, but also it's an extremely diverse community, but extremely segregated as well. It's very clear from who gets put in what programs, who gets into AP classes, where you live in the community. So to kind of go to TC and to live that experience, it's kind of hard to not have your eyes be fairly opened. And as I grew in my knowledge of cities and politics, just thinking about where I even grew up in Alexandria, that I grew up in a neighborhood, in a home that my dad could afford with a government job, that I had lived next door to a park. I could walk to my school. You know what? We basically had abolition in my neighborhood. There were no police in my neighborhood. No police ever came to my neighborhood. And so I grew up, and I had a bunch of friends who lived 3 blocks away and lived in drastically different environments. And so I came to really quickly appreciate and understand the power of money, of race, of real estate, of school boundaries, of policing, and how all those things came to make who I am today. And then kind of in a slightly more personal front, in the last number of years, when I was living up in Michigan and a new father, I'll take a little bit of blame for it, but I received a notice of potential eviction. And it was shocking and traumatic and terrifying. And not that I've not been untouched by those systems, but as someone who worked in housing, been working on housing for 20 years, we weren't really talking about evictions 20 years ago, even though they were happening, no doubt. But I think the material, and as I've moved into more public health thinking too, just the kind of trauma and the material damage of an eviction, especially as we're thinking about housing as a long-term process, developing new housing, new funding for housing, zoning we'll talk about. But the crisis of evictions, the materiality of it, the trauma of it for families and children was just really jaw-dropping and shocking to me, and kind of, I had a fire under me, but it definitely relit the fire under me. And now to be in the nation's capital of evictions, I think is not something that lets me sit still much at all. So that's a little bit of kind of how I got here, and yeah.
That's why I always ask that question. People always have such powerful stories that we don't know what's the fire behind, why they're doing the awesome work in the areas that they're working in. So you all are new to Richmond. Like you said, it's the capital of the former capital of the Confederacy. We're like number 2 in eviction. So we gotta change our reputation here. But what are maybe 1 or 2 of the biggest inequities that you see in Richmond in general, but also in your work? And I know for Stephen, you kind of working in the child welfare system, but also, having this great passion about housing. You can talk about either or both, or neither one, but what do you see, maybe 1 or 2, or what are the biggest inequities that you see in this city or in this region?
Go for it, Stephen.
I'll go first on this one. Yeah, I mean, I think the one I always go back to is the particularly with my background a little bit in public health and health equity, is the life expectancy maps that you see made all over the country now, which is really useful. But as people probably know who are listening to this, we have a 20-year life expectancy gap from probably my corner of the fan to across the river, or even down the street, to be frank. And that's just, morally unacceptable. And life expectancy, I think, is a useful term because it not only signifies the literal, robbing of years of life, but it also kind of encapsulates all of these systems that we're talking about, from the real estate redlining history to which pools get built and rebuilt and which pools don't get rebuilt, where bus lines are going, where the police are spending their time in the street and where they're not, where child welfare cases are being pursued and not. All of these things align and contribute to this incredible divergence in inequity in life expectancy between geographies and races. And then just kind of to build on that, I've already mentioned evictions, but the great work by the RVA Eviction Lab has really highlighted that it's not only the density of evictions is, not only correlated with income and neighborhood, but very much correlated with race. And so the data is clear on that. And so from robbing people of their homes to robbing people of their years alive, to me, are 2 inequities that are critical to address.
Absolutely. And you hit on it. It's both life and livelihood, right? So where you live kind of determines everything. So how long you will live, the quality of your housing, your neighborhood services, the quality of your schools, whether public services in general are responsive to your needs. So absolutely. What about you, Laura? What are your thoughts?
So before I moved to Richmond, I talked to someone I worked with in the voting rights field who has lived in Richmond for a while. And he said it's, referred to as a former capital of the Confederacy. And he's like, oh, it still is the capital of the Confederacy. And that was like the framing that I had coming to the city. And it definitely feels that way. Stephen talked about the maps of evictions, and it overlays exactly where redlining occurred, where the interstate system was built that destroyed historically Black neighborhoods and forced people into public housing without any, investment in public housing to make sure that it's still a healthy and safe place to live. But I've been here also just taking in the context of experience that I've had with working at other legal nonprofits, the need to include voices of disenfranchised people and working on the solution. There's an organizer with Legal Aid Justice Center, Omari Al Qaddafi, and he is the one who taught me that the people closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And that is an aspect that I try to take into account every day in my work. And it's something that my organization can do better. A lot of other nonprofits can do better. City managers can do better, instead of having this sort of ivory tower way to approach these issues. We can come up with great ideas of how to fix all these things, but the people living there should have a say in how to fix it. They probably have a clear understanding of why the temperature in their neighborhood is a good 5 degrees than it is over in the fan, and the solutions to that. I think there's a great example of a lesson learned from in Detroit. There is a project to plant trees across the city, but at no point did they go and ask the people who live there or do community engagement to see if this is something that they wanted. And so you had a lot of people turn down getting trees planted there just because of past experience they had where the city came and cut down the trees that were previously there, ostensibly to deal with tree disease. But for the residents, it's like, oh, it's because immediately after that, they increased surveillance in our neighborhood and we're getting hounded by the police. So as we're thinking through these inequities, it also has to be an equitable approach to how we come up with the solutions, working with communities so that they're leading that discussion and the solution. That's not easy by any means. And if you're doing that, you have to compensate people for their time and energy put into it. But I think it's a worthwhile investment.
Thanks, Laura. And you jumped right into solutions. So that's great. So I'm going to ask both of you of I'm asking everybody, one sentence, what's your vision for racial equity in Richmond? I'll probably include some of the reverse of the things that you've talked about. And what are some things we can do to get there? So you've hit on, and actually, maybe this, I've been talking to a bunch of people, and exactly what you said, Laura, is the thing that has come up over and over again. I actually think it's been the bedrock of every conversation or solution that people said. We have to have the people that are most impacted be a part of the solution, right? And engaged early, ongoing, and be in positions where they can determine the outcome and actually have power, right? So what's your vision? How do we get there from your perspective?
Yeah, just to build on those points, I think you guys are both exactly right. I mean, I think my vision is where poor and vulnerable people of color have legitimate political power, have legitimate, including unhoused people, non-English speakers, LGBTQ, whether that's on council, whether that's, strong community organizations that are actually funded and actually doing, day-to-day trust building and organizing. But I think the reality is this is a political problem. And I think it's great that we have a lot of organizations like ours as well that is trying to lift up voices, center those voices, decenter our own voices, acknowledge expertise where we hadn't in the past. But I think, how do we get to a place where we have legitimate political power, legitimate political voice for those who have 20 years less of life, for those who are being over surveilled by the police? I'm not hearing those voices in any real political context in terms of resources and material benefits. So I think it is a kind of political, a political change of some kind.
Absolutely. What about you, Laura?
Yeah, I think he's really getting to the point there. Thinking specifically in the legal field, as an attorney, you have to realize that I'm a gatekeeper of sorts. Having access and the specialized knowledge to a very complicated thing that people go to school to get the specialized training, but the law is made by lawyers for the benefit of lawyers, and that keeps certain people out from understanding what the law is, how to access justice in the courts, whether you believe that can be done or not. And so, democratizing the law. And that's true not just of the legal field, but also applies in other contexts, whether it comes to urban planning, whether it comes to financial models for being able to buy and afford a house. It goes across every aspect of recognizing the role that we play as gatekeepers and how we can open that up for other people.
I love that. I have the exact same conversation the other day when I was like, these conversations, lots of folks I'm talking to are gatekeepers in the community, and how can we use that position to open the gate, not to close it, or to take down the gate?
Yeah.
Right? Why do we even have the gate? So I love that you said that and pointed to that in this, the conversation around how do we just have a better and functioning democracy where people who have a true voice in the process and the things that are going to impact their lives. So thank y'all for that. And specifically, I want y'all to talk about, because you all know each other because you worked on a recent housing report. And so talk a little bit about, how you got into that, what do you feel like the biggest takeaways from that were, and kind of what can we do with the information that you all gleaned in that process and product?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, you can go to psgrichmond.org and find that report we put out, an affordable housing platform. PSG, Virginia Poverty Law Center, and Richmond for All put it out together. It's got a number of kind of policy recommendations, and I'll speak to one or two. But, I've been working in housing advocacy outside and inside the system for 20 some years. And so coalition building, I think, is critical, as well as having a certain language and focus on key policies. As I talked earlier, evictions not really being on the radar 20 years ago, are now much more on the radar. And so in the affordable housing world, there can be challenges because there's a need for wealth building, home ownership for low and moderate families. That's a very legitimate need that Richmond has a bad history with, and there's a lot of groups doing that. But I also, in my thinking around housing in this city and region, with the eviction crisis, life expectancy issues, the scale of the need for those with the lowest income in terms of being able to find a safe, healthy, affordable place to live in the city is extremely limited. And so we really found that the political conversation, the community conversation was kind of missing the target on where we needed to focus our attention in terms of resources, in terms of policies. And so I guess I'll talk briefly about two that I think are really critical. I'll talk about zoning briefly and about kind of our public resources. So one thing about zoning, I'm a planner nerd, I'll try not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I think conceptually, there's a connection between the massive developments happening in Scott's Addition and on the Pulse Corridor and the lack of investment in other neighborhoods. Those two are politically connected, real estate connected, community connected. Mm-hmm. And so when we, as a public, as a community, come forward for a plan for Broad, a plan for Scott's Addition, that's a trust building process where we are generating private value, to be frank. We're generating real estate value based on an expectation that we will get certain material community benefits in return. And I think that trust has been deeply broken. I think that as we are looking as a city that can grow, that wants to grow, that bringing people to the city is a good thing, but we should not look askew and not understand that new people coming to the city creates a deeper demand for affordable housing. And so really conceptually and policy-wise saying this new development generates a need for housing in another community, and those two should be linked in policy. So I feel strongly, so we talk a lot about kind of zoning reforms that can kind of come out of the Richmond 300 plan and things like that. And the one more thing I'll note, and then I'll pass it to Laura to add on, is another resource and opportunity is related to just our public resources, public land and public housing in particular. Public land is ours. We own it. It should benefit us to the maximum degree, and it should benefit those who have the greatest need. And so as we're moving forward with whether it's massive developments that we might not support, or smaller developments, or school redevelopments, or DMV redevelopments, affordable housing for those with lowest income should absolutely be a priority because it's a public resource that's ours that we get to decide about. And relatedly, public housing. It's a community that's public. And our treatment of the residents has been absolutely despicable in terms of the quality of the housing, the evictions. There should be a one-for-one replacement moving forward. The residents in the community should be treated with respect and dignity. My community, my upbringing was treated with respect and dignity. And so I really believe that the same should be happening for public housing that is public and that we should support. So those were two that we really covered that I really believe in. I'll pass on to Laura to add some more context or things she wants to discuss.
Laura, before you add on, Stephen, I wanted you to talk just slightly just about zonings, right? So I understand if like zoning, but like, what do you mean? Are you advocating that we need more multifamily zoning, we need less single family zoning, just to kind of conceptualize for people that aren't planners or legal background? What does that mean for you?
Yep. So there are complexities because of state law. So I don't want us to go down a state law and authority route, which is, we have Laura here who's an expert. We can do that for another specialized YouTube session, Zoom session. But conceptually, and other jurisdictions do this, I do think there should be multifamily zoning. We want dense housing near transit. It's better for the environment. It's better for people's health. It generates more revenue for the city. So we are supportive of more intense development in the appropriate places. But we also think there should be opportunities for including, in other jurisdictions, it's called inclusionary zoning, where they have authority, like in DC, you can require a certain % of the units are affordable. So that's one strategy. In Virginia, I would suggest that's a much more complicated to actually get the units in those buildings. But in a rezoning, the idea being when a developer comes and says, oh, I own a 3-story garage in Scott's Addition, can I rezone this up to 10 stories to get a luxury condos? We'd say great, but in exchange for going from 3 stories to 10 stories, you include some units, or if you don't want to do that, include some units next door in the neighborhood, or write us a check, and then we can use that money to then go and fix up the pool at Gilpin, or we can go that to create a rent supplement program. And so in exchange for a developer voluntarily saying, ooh, I can get 7 more stories of private value that's created by the public, we should be able to say, we would like a check to go into our trust fund or a supplement program or whatever it might be to fund the housing demand that you're generating by creating this development.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Sorry, hopefully that wasn't too wonky, but that's the idea.
No, I think you brought it down. I just wanted, because folks say zoning, and I think
I know,
the average everyday person is like, okay, how is that going to impact me? But I think that you broke it down well, but also showed the limitations really of living in Virginia, which is a Dillon rule state. So that's even more wonky, but I want to hear from Laura, like, what do you have to add to that? What nuance, what complementary to the conversation about the report you all did and some of the recommendations there?
Sure. I mean, I got pulled into this coalition as the city was voting on the Richmond 300 plan, which they went and did some public input, during COVID, which makes it really complicated. I think it's a demonstration of how hard it is to do community engagement. But we received pushback when we sent a letter with recommendations like, oh, well, why did you do this before? But our point is community engagement doesn't stop there. It continues through the entire process. It's an ongoing commitment, not just putting together a draft of a plan. It has to continue through as city council is considering it, as they're putting these recommendations into place. It's not a one-stop shop. It's a commitment through the entire process. And that's what we are acting on. Additionally, some of our criticism of the plan is that just wholesale adopted existing industry practices and, Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority's plans redevelopment and just saying like, oh, we're resigning ourselves. It's impossible to adequately produce housing for extremely low income people. So those who are making 30 cents below the area median income. And that's just not true. There's so much creative thinking that other places have already tried. And that, like I said, if you're actually doing deep community involvement, that I'm sure that people have solutions and ideas too. Stephen talked about the idea of a local rent supplement program. that is one way to bridge the gap between those sort of subsidies to try to incentivize inclusion of affordable dwelling units, which really serve people who are between 15-80% of area median income and those of the lowest means. So a voucher can bridge that gap to make it to where it is a unit that is accessible for someone with a voucher. And that there are restrictions that, limitations because we're a Dillon rule state, which basically means that the city only has authority to act in a way as expressly granted by the General Assembly. And the General Assembly has put certain limitations on how development can occur, how they can structure property tax programs and incentives. That said, there's a lot of wiggle room within there of creative solutions that other localities have figured out that surely we also can do as a city to address our deep need for housing across, all income levels, but especially for low income folks. Stephen touched on, the redevelopment of public housing. They're trying to put people on vouchers and expecting them to go find housing in the city, but there's just not enough affordable housing, and there's not enough support for those residents and securing that housing on, having that security deposit to be able to get into a unit in the first place. And that's something that, if you're going to be demolishing this public land, turning it into a public-private partnership, you need to have a deeper commitment and support of those residents that you're kicking out.
Yeah, I love that. I like you all were, pushing the envelope of these are commendable, but I think that we can do better as a city. We can clearly do better as a state, particularly I think that once you probably get 50 and below area median income, right, it gets really, really difficult to serve that, right? And so that's not that we shouldn't serve that. That means it's difficult, and we need to put more time and energy and resources to be more creative and innovative around that. So I love that you all were kind of pushing the envelope and the kind of the status quo on these things and saying, yes, these are great commitments, but how can we do more? How can we be more creative and innovative? And how can we meet the needs of people that are falling through the cracks, right? If they're regular, everyday middle-class folks are struggling to find affordable housing, like housing prices in my neighborhood have skyrocketed, right? So what do you think it's going to be like for people that make a small percentage of what we deem kind of middle class in Richmond? So
no, I think that's a really good point. And just to kind of add and kind of circle up with what we said before, to serve people with the lowest income is more expensive. It takes more resources. And, we've also been working closely with Richmonders involved in strengthening our community's risk. They've been beating the drum for the Housing Trust Fund, which is one of the critical tools needed to build a supply of affordable housing. But I would suggest the city council has not committed to that at any kind of commensurate level. And to really serve low income folks, we're going to need something like a local rent supplement program, which can essentially pay people's rent. I mean, this is what's going on around the city as we're figuring out low barrier, no barrier ways to get cash in people's hands, that if they need to pay their rent, they got to pay their rent. If they got to pay childcare, they got to pay the childcare. If they got to pay a car bill, they can pay their car bill. But and so I think that goes back to my point of, this is a political question. We are spending $90-some million a year on our police force. And spending, 1 or 2 on our trust fund. We are, we probably need to raise revenue in other ways. And so these are real political questions, and that, if we are serious, if we're not serious, that's fine. But if we're serious, we see the price tag and we look at our budget and think about where we're currently spending money and what could change, or where we find new money. And so I just think that is a real, brass tacks political conversation that our system does not quite seem to be up to at the moment. So
yeah, highlighting that, I think that's a really important point, that lots of these problems, they're hard and they're costly, but they're actually doable. We don't have the political will to actually do them, or we don't want to make the changes and the sacrifices and the tough conversations that it will require. Laura, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and underscoring is, a point that Stephen made earlier about treating people with dignity. So often we hear politicians say oh, we need housing for, firemen and teachers. And it's yeah, that's true. But they, low wage earners are deserve equal dignity also deserve healthy, safe housing that is affordable. So why are we making this unnecessary distinction to divide people? They all need housing. Our low wage earners are city employees. They're doing some of the toughest jobs in the city. And so, they deserve that respect as well. This is going on in Charlottesville right now when they're dealing with their, zoning, where you have homeowners who seem to think that they should have more of a say than rights than renters. And that's just not true. Property owners shouldn't have any more of a say than renters who live in the city. Everyone should be treated equally because we all have an interest in ensuring that, if we have a safe place to live, we have transportation to get to our jobs, we have, a good school to send our kids to, access to healthy food that benefits everybody, not just homeowners.
Absolutely. Well, thank y'all so much. This has been a really cool and interesting conversation. I love you guys definitely brought a unique perspective to the show. It's about time for us to wrap up, but want to give you all, 5-10 seconds. You have anything to say or to encourage the audience as we close this conversation with you both?
We're always interested in building bridges with other folks who are working in this issue area, who are new to it. I think we recognize our own limitations on who we are, who we represent, and that we need more diverse voices. So we welcome others to join our coalition and help deepen these conversations.
Absolutely. And what's the name of the coalition, Laura?
I don't know if we have a formal name. I don't know, Stephen, have you come up with one?
No, I don't think we have a formal one yet. We haven't done any of the administrative bureaucratic steps yet, but no, I want to second what Laura says. The path to racial equity and equitable community engagement is a long, windy, hard one. And we are definitely open and looking for, we have resources to support community partners. And so please reach out to myself or Laura. And I want to thank all the people who are doing that community work. This is a city that institutionally does not seem to have supported community organizers. And so those who are out there grinding and doing the community organizing, I just want to shout you out and thank you and try to lift your voice up as much as I can. So thank you.
Well, thank y'all for being on the show today. This has been a lovely conversation. Hopefully it will continue in lots of other ways. Again, this is a Racial Equity in Richmond, the web series, and we've had Stephen Wade and Laura Dobbs on our show today. Thank y'all so much for your time, energy, wisdom, perspective, and really the important perspectives and voices that you all are lifting up, but also the work that you do every day. Y'all have a good one. Thank y'all for viewing. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Amy.